My 16-year-old grandson pushed me into the lake while I was still recovering from heart surgery. As I thrashed in the cold water, gasping and choking, he stood on the dock, laughing. "Don't be so dramatic, Grandpa," he called out while I fought for my life. My son and daughter-in-law rushed over with fake concern, but never actually helped me climb out. A week later, they received letters that wiped those smug smiles right off their faces. Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The smell of charcoal and burning meat filled the late afternoon air as I watched my family gather around the wooden dock I'd built with my own hands 30 years ago. The lake stretched out before us, mirror smooth and deceptively peaceful, reflecting the golden light that filtered through the oak trees my late wife Eleanor had planted. I'd chosen to host this barbecue despite my doctor's warnings about overexertion. Just 3 months after my heart surgery, I still felt the tender pull of healing tissue with every deep breath. But seeing David's family together, watching my grandson Ryan laugh with his cousins, made the risk seem worth it. The deck chairs creaked under the weight of relatives I hadn't seen in months, their voices mixing with the gentle lap of water against the dock posts. Ryan appeared beside me without warning, his 16-year-old frame already taller than mine, all sharp elbows and restless energy. He'd been quieter than usual today, responding to my attempts at conversation with shrugs and half-smiles. I remembered being his age, remembered the way the world felt both too small and impossibly vast at the same time. "Beautiful day for this, isn't it?" I said, gesturing toward the lake where a pair of ducks glided across the surface, leaving gentle V-shaped wakes behind them. He nodded, but didn't look at me, his attention fixed on something I couldn't see. The late afternoon sun caught the water just right, turning it into liquid gold, and I felt grateful to be here, alive, surrounded by the people who mattered most. The push came without warning, a sharp, sudden pressure against my back that sent me stumbling forward. My hands shot out instinctively, grasping at air, at nothing as gravity took hold and pulled me toward the water. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. I had a split second to see the lake rushing up to meet me, to register the shocked faces of the guests who'd turned to watch, to hear the collective intake of breath that comes just before disaster strikes. Then the cold water closed over my head, and everything changed. The impact drove what little air I had from my lungs, and I felt my body sink beneath the surface, the familiar lake suddenly alien and hostile. My surgical scar blazed with pain as the cold water soaked through my shirt, and panic, raw, primal panic, flooded my system. I thrashed upward, breaking the surface with a gasp that burned my throat. Water filled my mouth as I tried to call for help, the metallic taste of lake water mixing with the copper flavor of fear. My arms windmilled frantically, searching for something, anything, to hold on to as I struggled to stay afloat. The dock seemed impossibly far away, though I knew it was only a few feet. My chest felt like it might split open, the healing tissue screaming in protest with every desperate stroke I took toward safety. Through the water streaming down my face, I could see figures moving on the dock. David, Clara, the other guests. But their voices seemed to come from a great distance. My waterlogged clothes dragged at my limbs, making every movement an exhausting battle against the lake that had once been my sanctuary. That's when I heard it. Ryan's laugh. Bright and clear and utterly without remorse. "Don't be so dramatic, Grandpa," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the water. The words hit me harder than the cold lake had, each syllable a small betrayal that cut deeper than my surgical scar ever could. I saw him standing where I'd been moments before, his hands shoved casually into his pockets, watching my struggle with what looked almost like amusement. The other guests had fallen silent, their barbecue conversations dying as they witnessed something that couldn't quite be laughed off or explained away. Even the ducks had disappeared, leaving the lake's surface broken only by the ripples of my desperate movements and the steady lap of water against the dock posts. "Dad! Hold on! Careful! Are you okay?" David's voice rang out across the water, full of what sounded like genuine alarm. But as I fought my way toward the dock, my vision clearing with each stroke, I noticed something that chilled me more than the lake water ever could. Neither David nor Clara had moved from where they stood. Their faces wore expressions of concern, their voices carried all the right notes of worry and fear, but their feet remained planted firmly on the dock. No one reached out a hand to help me. No one jumped in. They stood there like actors in a play, delivering their lines with perfect timing while I clawed my way up the wooden ladder, my shirt clinging to my chest and water streaming from my hair. The rough wood scraped against my palms as I hauled myself onto the dock, my legs shaking with exhaustion, and something else. Something that felt like the first cold touch of understanding. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I climbed toward my bedroom, each step sending a fresh wave of cold through my soaked clothes. My polo shirt clung to my chest like a second skin, the fabric rough against the tender scar tissue that still pulled tight with every breath. Water dripped steadily from my hair onto the hardwood floors, leaving a trail of dark spots that would probably stain if I didn't clean them soon. But I couldn't bring myself to care about water damage when my own grandson's laughter still echoed in my ears. The sound had followed me up from the dock, casual and cruel, as if pushing a recovering heart patient into a lake was nothing more than harmless fun. I reached the landing and paused, my hand gripping the banister I'd carved from oak, salvaged from our property, trying to steady both my breathing and the tremor that had started in my fingers. Behind me, the barbecue continued as if nothing had happened. I could hear David's voice drifting up from the patio, animated and cheerful as he told some story about his latest business deal. The guests had stayed, I realized. Whatever awkwardness my unexpected swim had created, it had been smoothed over quickly enough that people felt comfortable finishing their potato salad and beer. Through my bedroom window, I caught glimpses of them still gathered around the picnic tables, their conversations flowing as easily as they had before. I'd found myself gasping for air in water I'd swum in countless times as a younger man. Clara's distinctive laugh rang out above the others, light and musical, the same laugh that had charmed me when David first brought her home 15 years ago. Back then, I'd thought myself lucky to gain a daughter-in-law who seemed so genuinely warm, so eager to be part of our family. Now that laugh made something cold settle in my stomach. I stripped off my wet clothes with shaking hands, my reflection in the bedroom mirror showing a man I barely recognized. My chest looked pale and fragile, the surgical scar an angry red line that divided me from collarbone to sternum, like a roadmap of vulnerability. The cardiologist had warned me about overexertion, about the importance of avoiding stress during these crucial months of recovery. "Your heart needs time to heal," Dr. Patterson had said, his voice gentle but firm. "Think of yourself as a vintage car that needs careful handling." I'd laughed at the comparison then, but now it felt prophetic. Vintage cars were valuable, sure, but they were also fragile, prone to breaking down at inconvenient moments. They required expensive maintenance and careful owners who understood their worth. I wondered, as I reached for a dry shirt, if my family saw me as valuable or just expensive to maintain. The thought settled in my chest beside the ache that never quite went away, both physical and emotional pain blending until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The sound of laughter drifted up from downstairs again, but this time it came from inside the house rather than the patio. I paused in buttoning my shirt, straining to hear more clearly. The voices were muffled by distance and closed doors, but I could make out the rhythm of conversation punctuated by bursts of amusement. It was coming from the kitchen, I realized. The heart of the house where Eleanor had spent so many hours preparing meals for the family gatherings she'd loved so much. She'd always said the kitchen was where the real conversations happened, where people let their guards down and spoke honestly because they felt safe, surrounded by the warmth of home cooking and familiar spaces. I'd never paid much attention to those conversations before, trusting that whatever was said in our kitchen was said with love. But standing there in my bedroom, still damp from the lake and raw from my grandson's casual cruelty, I found myself wishing I could hear what was being discussed in such animated tones just 2 floors below me. A soft knock interrupted my eavesdropping attempt. I turned toward the door, expecting to see David, or maybe one of the guests checking on my welfare. Instead, Maria's weathered face appeared in the doorway, her arms laden with thick towels that smelled of the lavender fabric softener she'd been using for the past decade. She'd been with our family for 15 years now, ever since Eleanor's arthritis made maintaining the house too difficult. At 62, Maria moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken aloud. Her dark eyes held a warmth that reminded me of my late wife's compassion. But today, there was something else there. A hesitation that made her usual confidence seem fragile. She stepped into the room without waiting for permission, closing the door behind her with the kind of care that suggested she didn't want to be overheard. The click of the latch seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet of the bedroom, and I noticed her glance toward the hallway before meeting my eyes. "Mr. George," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you need to dry your hair properly, or you'll catch cold." She handed me the largest towel, her fingers brushing mine briefly. They were warm and steady, a sharp contrast to my own trembling hands. But instead of leaving as she usually did after delivering fresh linens, she remained standing near the door, her expression troubled. Her mouth opened and closed twice before she finally found the words she was looking for. "I heard them laughing down in the kitchen," she said, each word carefully measured, as if she was weighing the consequences of speaking against the necessity of truth. "Ryan was imitating you flailing around, saying you looked like a stranded fish." The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable carving away another piece of the naive trust I'd carried for 67 years. But Maria wasn't finished. Her next words came out in a rush, as if she feared losing her courage. "And Clara said, 'Good thing he didn't break a hip. Would have ruined the weekend.'" I froze completely, the towel hanging forgotten in my hands. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the house itself was reacting to this revelation. Maria's words echoed in the suddenly too quiet space, each repetition making them more real and more devastating. Ryan imitating my desperate struggle in the water, turning my terror into entertainment for his parents. Clara, the woman I'd welcomed as a daughter, whose children I'd helped raise, whose mortgage payments I'd quietly assisted with during David's lean years, reducing my near-drowning to an inconvenience that might have disrupted her social calendar. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking in its completeness. These weren't the words of people who'd been genuinely frightened for my safety. These were the words of people who viewed me as an aging inconvenience, a source of potential embarrassment, rather than a beloved family patriarch. I sank onto the edge of my bed, my legs suddenly unreliable, and Maria's expression softened with sympathy that felt like salt in an open wound. The house continued its celebration below us, the sounds of family happiness now transformed into something sinister by Maria's revelation. Every laugh from the kitchen took on new meaning. Every burst of conversation became a potential mockery, I wasn't meant to hear. I thought of all the times I'd attributed David's impatience to work stress. All the occasions when Clara's attention seemed forced, and I'd told myself she was simply tired from managing her busy household. How many other conversations had happened in my kitchen, in my house, where my family dissected my weaknesses and laughed at my vulnerabilities? How long had I been the unwitting subject of their private entertainment, performing the role of the grateful, doddering patriarch, while they counted the days until my life insurance would make them wealthy? The questions multiplied in my mind like cancer cells, each one spawning dozens more until I felt dizzy with the implications. I walked to my dresser, with steps that felt disconnected from my body, my hands moving automatically to open the second drawer where I kept my personal papers. Beneath tax documents and insurance policies, my fingers found the leather-bound notebook Eleanor had given me for my 60th birthday. "For your thoughts," she'd said, pressing it into my hands with a smile that still haunted my dreams. I'd never written in it, saving it for some future moment when I'd have something profound to record. But as I sat on the edge of our bed, my bed now, I reminded myself, with Maria's words still ringing in my ears, I realized that moment had arrived. I uncapped the old fountain pen Eleanor had loved and wrote my first entry in careful, precise letters. "They think I'm weak. They forgot who built this house." The ink flowed dark against the cream-colored paper, each word a small act of defiance that felt surprisingly satisfying. But as I set the pen down and looked at that single line, I realized it was only the beginning. There was so much more I needed to understand about my family's true feelings toward me, and I had a terrible suspicion that what I'd learned today was just the surface of something much deeper and more calculating than simple thoughtlessness. The marble steps of First National Bank felt cold beneath my shoes as I climbed them slowly, my chest tight with something that wasn't entirely physical pain. Sleep had been impossible the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Ryan's mocking laughter and Clara's casual dismissal of my near drowning. The notebook lay open on my nightstand, that single line of ink staring back at me like an accusation. They think I'm weak. They forgot who built this house. But building houses and building trust, I was beginning to understand, required entirely different sets of skills. The morning air carried the scent of exhaust and coffee from the cafe next door, ordinary smells that should have been comforting, but somehow felt foreign, as if I was seeing my familiar downtown through different eyes. The brass handle of the bank's front door felt heavier than usual in my grip, or maybe it was just that everything required more effort when you suspected the people you loved most were counting the days until your funeral. Margaret looked up from her desk as I approached, her professional smile warming into something more genuine when she recognized me. She'd been handling my accounts for nearly 8 years now, ever since the bank promoted her to private banking, after she'd helped me navigate the complexities of Eleanor's medical expenses during her final illness. Her black hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn every time I'd seen her, and her dark suit conveyed the kind of competence that made wealthy retirees feel confident about their financial decisions. "Mr. Miller," she said, rising from her chair with the fluid grace of someone much younger than her 40-something years. "I wasn't expecting to see you today. How can I help you?" There was genuine warmth in her voice, the kind of professional concern that came from years of dealing with elderly clients who sometimes needed more hand-holding than they cared to admit. I settled into the leather chair across from her desk, my hands folded in my lap to hide their slight tremor. "I'd like to review Ryan's education fund," I said, keeping my voice level despite the way my heart hammered against my ribs. "The account I established for his college expenses." Margaret's fingers moved efficiently across her keyboard, her expression shifting to the focused concentration she wore when dealing with serious financial matters. The computer screen reflected in her glasses as she pulled up the account details, and I found myself holding my breath, as if those numbers could somehow explain the growing chasm between the family I thought I had and the family I was beginning to discover. She frowned slightly at something on the screen, her perfectly shaped eyebrows drawing together in a way that suggested she'd found information that required delicate handling. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of other bank patrons conducting their business in the lobby beyond her office door. "The balance is currently $60,000, she said carefully, her eyes meeting mine with the kind of directness that suggested she was choosing her words with unusual care. "But, Mr. Miller, I need to inform you of some recent activity on this account." Her pause felt loaded with implications, and I leaned forward slightly, my hands gripping the arms of the chair with enough force to make my knuckles white. "Your son David has contacted us several times over the past 2 months asking about transfer procedures in the event of certain circumstances." She couldn't quite bring herself to say the words, but we both understood what certain circumstances meant. My death. David had been calling to find out how quickly he could access Ryan's education fund once I was no longer around to manage it. The knowledge hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath more effectively than the lake water had the day before. "I see," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "And what information did you provide him?" Margaret's discomfort was visible in the way she straightened papers that didn't need straightening, her professional demeanor warring with what looked like genuine concern for my welfare. She'd probably dealt with similar situations before. Elderly clients discovering that their children were more interested in inheritance timelines than family relationships. But knowing that didn't make the reality any less devastating. "We provided general information about beneficiary procedures," she said carefully. "Nothing specific without your written authorization, of course. But Mr. Miller—" She paused, clearly debating whether to cross the line from banker to concerned advisor. "He seemed very focused on timing and immediate access. I thought you should know." The weight of her unspoken concern settled over me like a heavy blanket, and I nodded slowly, my mind already calculating the implications of David's inquiries. I drove home in a fog of revelation and growing anger, my hands tight on the steering wheel as I navigated streets I'd traveled for decades. The familiar landmarks, the corner grocery where Eleanor used to buy fresh flowers every Friday, the park where I'd taught David to ride his bike, the elementary school where Ryan had once proudly displayed his art projects, all looked different now, tainted by the knowledge that my family viewed me as a financial asset, rather than a person worth loving. The house came into view as I turned onto Maple Street, its white columns and wraparound porch as welcoming as always, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was returning to enemy territory. Maria's car was parked in the driveway beside David's sedan, which meant the family was still here, still playing their roles as devoted relatives while privately calculating how much longer they'd need to maintain the charade. I pulled into the garage slowly, needing those few extra moments to compose myself before facing people who apparently saw me as little more than a walking bank account with an inconveniently slow expiration date. The smell of Maria's pot roast greeted me as I entered through the kitchen door. Rich and savory, and normally comforting enough to make my mouth water despite my reduced appetite since the surgery. But today, even that familiar pleasure felt hollow, overshadowed by the knowledge that every family dinner might be nothing more than an investment in future inheritances. I could hear voices from the living room, David's deep baritone mixing with Clara's lighter tones, and Ryan's occasional teenage interjections. They sounded so normal, so genuinely familial, that for a moment I wondered if I was imagining sinister motives where none existed. Maybe David's calls to the bank were simply practical planning, the kind of responsible financial preparation any good son would undertake. Maybe Clara's comment about my hip was just thoughtless relief, rather than calculated callousness. But then I remembered Ryan's laugh as I struggled in the water, and any charitable interpretations crumbled under the weight of that memory. "Grandpa!" Ryan's voice carried from the living room as my footsteps announced my return. "We were wondering where you went." He appeared in the kitchen doorway with a smile that would have seemed genuine if I hadn't known about his fish impression from the night before. His hair was tousled in the artfully casual way teenagers perfected, and he wore a concert t-shirt for some band I'd never heard of over expensive jeans that I'd probably helped pay for indirectly through the allowance David provided. At 16, he was already taller than his father and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world or questioned whether the people around him had his best interests at heart. That confidence, which I'd once found endearing, now struck me as something darker. The assurance of someone who believed he could get away with anything because he'd never faced real consequences. "Just had some errands to run," I said, forcing my voice to remain casual as I moved toward the refrigerator. "Banking business? Nothing exciting." I caught the slight tightening around Ryan's eyes, a micro-expression that might have been concern, or might have been something else entirely. "You know how it is with finances when you get to be my age. Have to stay on top of things." I pulled out a bottle of water, mainly to give my hands something to do, while I watched his reaction. He nodded with the kind of polite attention teenagers reserved for adult topics that bored them, but I noticed his phone was already back in his hand, his thumbs moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. The casual dismissal stung more than I expected. Once, he would have asked follow-up questions, or at least pretended interest in my activities. Now, I rated less attention than whatever digital conversation was happening on his screen. Dinner that evening felt like a performance where everyone knew their lines except me. I sat at the head of the table I'd built from reclaimed barn wood, watching my family play their parts with increasing fascination and horror. David carved the roast with efficient precision, his knife work accompanied by cheerful commentary about his latest real estate deal. Clara served vegetables with the kind of attentive care that suggested deep concern for everyone's nutritional well-being, asking twice if I was eating enough protein for proper healing. Even Ryan contributed to the domestic theater, complimenting Maria's cooking and asking about my physical therapy appointments with what sounded like genuine interest. If I hadn't known what I knew, I would have been touched by their obvious affection and care. Instead, I felt like an anthropologist observing an alien species that had mastered the art of mimicking human emotion. "Ryan, next year's tuition fund will be ready," I said during a lull in the conversation, my voice deliberately warm and grandfatherly. "Just keep studying hard." The words felt strange in my mouth, loaded with implications that only I fully understood. I watched his face carefully, noting the flash of something. Guilt? Excitement? That crossed his features before settling into an expression of grateful humility. His parents exchanged a quick glance, the kind of wordless communication that long-married couples developed, and I found myself wondering what message had passed between them in that split second of eye contact. Were they pleased that I was still playing along with their expectations? Relieved that I remained oblivious to their true intentions? The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing would have been. "Thanks, Grandpa," Ryan said, his voice pitched perfectly between teenage embarrassment and genuine appreciation. "I'll make you proud." His phone was face down beside his plate, but I could see his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that suggested he was restraining himself from reaching for it. Then, as if he couldn't help himself, he picked it up and began typing with his thumbs, a half smirk playing around his mouth as he read whatever response his message had generated. The expression was there and gone in seconds, but it reminded me forcefully of the look on his face as he watched me struggle in the lake. There was something predatory about it, something that spoke of secrets shared and jokes enjoyed at someone else's expense. I took another bite of pot roast and chewed mechanically, my appetite completely gone, but my determination to maintain normalcy stronger than my physical discomfort. Later that evening, as I sat in my study reviewing some investment documents, Maria knocked softly on the doorframe. Her expression was troubled, the same look she'd worn when delivering yesterday's devastating news about the kitchen conversations. She glanced over her shoulder before stepping fully into the room, a gesture that had become familiar and deeply unsettling. "Mr. George," she said quietly. "I was dusting in the hallway upstairs when Mrs. Clara's phone rang." She paused, clearly struggling with the decision to share what she'd overheard. She answered it in the guest bedroom, probably thought no one could hear. Maria's hands twisted in her apron, and I realized she was as invested in my welfare as I was disturbed by my family's apparent betrayal. Her loyalty felt like a lifeline in an ocean of uncertainty. "She was talking to someone, a friend, I think, and she said—" Maria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That money's basically ours, just a matter of time." The words hit me with the force of physical blows, each syllable confirming what I'd begun to suspect, but hoped wasn't true. Clara, the woman who'd just fussed over my dinner portions and asked about my physical therapy, was discussing my death as if it were a business transaction with a predictable timeline. The casual certainty in her voice suggested this wasn't the first such conversation, and probably wouldn't be the last. I sat back in my leather chair, the familiar comfort of my study suddenly feeling like a museum exhibit. The preserved workspace of a man whose family was already dividing his possessions in their minds. I opened my notebook to the second page and wrote carefully, "They see me only as a wallet." But as I stared at those words, I realized they didn't capture the full scope of what I was beginning to understand. My family didn't just see me as a source of money. They saw me as an obstacle to that money, an inconvenient delay in their access to what they already considered rightfully theirs. The difference was subtle, but crucial, transforming me from a beloved patriarch with financial resources into a problem that would eventually solve itself through the natural course of aging and mortality. The realization was so devastating that for a moment I couldn't breathe, my surgical scar pulling tight, as if my heart was trying to protect itself from this new kind of damage. But beneath the pain, something else was growing. A cold, calculating anger that felt both foreign and strangely liberating. If they wanted to play games with my money and my life, perhaps it was time I learned the rules and started playing to win. I was adjusting the thermostat in the hallway when my foot caught the edge of the Persian rug. The stumble was minor, barely a loss of balance that I corrected within seconds. But the soft thud of my shoulder against the wall seemed to echo through the house with disproportionate volume. My surgical scar pulled tight as I steadied myself, a reminder that my body was still healing from the procedures that had saved my life 3 months ago. The morning light streaming through the stained glass window cast colored shadows on the hardwood floor, the same warm patterns that had greeted me every morning for 30 years. But today, those familiar rainbows felt ominous rather than comforting, as if even the house itself was warning me about the conversation I sensed was coming. From the kitchen, I could hear the low murmur of David and Clara's voices, their tones carrying the careful modulation people used when discussing sensitive subjects they hoped wouldn't be overheard. "Dad?" David's voice came from behind me, tinged with the kind of concerned urgency that parents used when their toddlers took unexpected tumbles. I turned to find him standing in the kitchen doorway, his expression a perfect blend of worry and barely concealed calculation. His tie was loosened from his morning meetings, and his sleeves were rolled up in a way that suggested he was settling in for a serious discussion rather than preparing to leave for more business appointments. Clara appeared beside him, her manicured fingers wrapped around a coffee mug that bore the faded logo of Ryan's middle school soccer team. Her smile was warm and genuine-looking, the kind of expression that had once made me grateful to have such a caring daughter-in-law. Now, knowing what I knew about her private conversations regarding my money, that smile felt like a mask carefully constructed to hide her true intentions. The silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken tensions and barely concealed agendas. "I'm fine," I said, straightening my shirt and forcing my voice to remain steady. "Just caught my foot on the rug, nothing serious." But even as I spoke the words, I could see David's eyes cataloging every detail of my minor mishap, his legal mind already constructing arguments about my declining physical condition and the safety hazards of living alone in such a large house. He'd been a litigation attorney for 15 years before switching to real estate, and I recognized the expression he wore when building a case. The same focused intensity he'd once directed at opposing counsel was now trained on me, his own father, and the realization was more chilling than my brief contact with the hallway wall. Clara nodded sympathetically, her head tilted at precisely the angle that conveyed deep concern without appearing patronizing. It was a masterful performance, and I found myself wondering how long they'd been rehearsing this scene. "Dad, maybe you should think about assisted living," David said, his voice carefully gentle as he moved closer. "You slipped today, and yesterday with the lake incident. We're just worried." The word "slipped" hung in the air between us, a deliberate mischaracterization that transformed Ryan's deliberate push into an accident caused by my own physical instability. I felt my jaw clench involuntarily as the full scope of their strategy became clear. They weren't just waiting for me to die naturally, they were actively constructing a narrative that would justify removing me from my own home and placing me somewhere they could more easily control my assets and medical decisions. The casual way David delivered this suggestion, as if it had just occurred to him rather than being a carefully planned opening gambit, showed a level of calculation that made my chest tight with something that wasn't entirely related to my recent surgery. Clara stepped forward with the fluid grace she'd perfected during her brief modeling career before marriage, her expression radiating the kind of compassionate concern that had probably served her well in PTA meetings and charity fundraisers. "We only want the best for you," she said, her voice pitched at exactly the right frequency to convey loving worry without seeming manipulative. "Places with 24-hour care. It'll be safer." She reached out and touched my arm with fingertips that felt cool against my skin, a gesture of connection that now seemed calculated to reinforce her words about my need for constant supervision. The phrase 24-hour care carried implications that went far beyond medical assistance. It suggested complete loss of independence, the kind of institutional control that would make it impossible for me to manage my own finances or make decisions about my property. I looked into her eyes, searching for some trace of genuine affection beneath the performance, but found only the focused attention of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan. "The Willows has an excellent reputation," David continued, seamlessly picking up Clara's thread as if they'd practiced this conversation multiple times. "I've already spoken with their admissions coordinator. They have a waiting list, but given your recent health issues, they might be able to expedite the process." The casual mention of his prior contact with the facility hit me like a physical blow. He'd been researching assisted living options before yesterday's incident, probably before my trip to the lake, maybe even before my surgery. This wasn't a spontaneous suggestion born from recent concerns. It was the culmination of a long-term strategy to remove me from the equation while maintaining plausible deniability about their motives. I could picture him and Clara discussing my placement over dinner, weighing the costs of private care against the benefits of having complete control over my assets. The image made my stomach turn in ways that had nothing to do with my prescription medications. "It's really quite lovely," Clara added, her voice taking on the bright, cheerful tone she used when discussing vacation destinations or restaurant recommendations. "Private rooms, beautiful gardens, organized activities. You wouldn't be lonely." The way she described it made assisted living sound like a resort rather than what it really was, a waiting room for death where inconvenient elderly relatives could be parked until their inheritances became available. Her emphasis on not being lonely struck me as particularly cruel, given that my current loneliness stemmed directly from discovering how my family really felt about me. The activities and gardens she mentioned wouldn't fill the void left by learning that the people I'd loved and supported for decades saw me primarily as a financial asset with an unfortunately slow depreciation schedule. But her tone remained relentlessly upbeat, as if enthusiasm could disguise the fact that she was advocating for my exile. I remained silent, letting their words wash over me while my mind raced through the implications of what they were proposing. The Willows was expensive. I'd looked into it briefly when Eleanor's dementia first appeared, before we decided to keep her at home with private care. The monthly fees were substantial enough that covering them would require significant portions of my investment income, effectively reducing the inheritance they were so eager to claim. Unless, of course, they were planning to have me declared incompetent and gain control of my finances directly. The possibility that they'd researched not just my physical placement, but also the legal mechanisms for assuming power of attorney sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the old house's windows. Their concern for my safety was beginning to look more like a carefully orchestrated campaign to strip away my independence and autonomy. "I know it's a big decision," David said, his voice dropping to the confidential tone he'd once used when explaining complex legal concepts to nervous clients. "But Dad, we want you to be safe. After what happened yesterday, and now this morning." He gestured toward the hallway where I'd briefly stumbled, as if a minor loss of balance were evidence of severe cognitive decline rather than the natural result of recovering from major surgery. "We just think it might be time to consider your options." The phrase, "your options," was particularly galling, given that he was essentially presenting me with a single choice disguised as concerned deliberation. The unstated message was clear: cooperate with their plans for assisted living, or face the possibility of having the decision made for me through legal channels that would be far more difficult to resist. Clara nodded emphatically, her blonde hair catching the morning light in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of Eleanor during her younger years. "And Ryan could visit you whenever he wanted," she added, as if my grandson's presence were some kind of reward for accepting their scheme rather than a natural right I shouldn't have to earn through compliance. "He's been so worried about you since yesterday." The lie was so blatant that I almost laughed out loud. Ryan, who had pushed me into the lake and then mocked my struggle to survive, was supposedly worried about my welfare? The boy who couldn't be bothered to look up from his phone during dinner conversations was allegedly concerned enough about my safety to support shipping me off to institutional care. The disconnect between Clara's words and the reality I'd observed was so complete that I wondered if she actually believed what she was saying, or if lying had become such second nature that she no longer distinguished between truth and convenient fiction. "I appreciate your concern," I said finally, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest like pressure in a faulty boiler. The words felt strange in my mouth, formal and distant, but they were all I could manage without revealing how clearly I saw through their performance. David's shoulders relaxed slightly, probably interpreting my calm response as the beginning of capitulation, rather than strategic silence. Clara's smile brightened, and she squeezed my arm again with what she probably thought was reassuring pressure. Neither of them seemed to recognize that my lack of immediate objection wasn't agreement. It was the careful restraint of someone who had finally understood the game being played and was planning his own moves accordingly. The conversation continued around me, with David mentioning visiting schedules and Clara discussing the facility's meal plans, but I was no longer fully present for their sales pitch. That evening, after David and Clara had returned to their own home, with promises to research options together and take things slowly, I sat in my study with the leather notebook open before me. The room felt different now, not the comfortable sanctuary where I'd paid bills and managed investments for decades, but a command center where I needed to plan my defense against people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The pen felt heavier than usual in my fingers as I wrote. They call it safety. I call it exile. But as I stared at those words, I realized they didn't capture the full scope of what I was beginning to understand about my family's intentions. This wasn't just about removing me from my home. It was about isolating me from any support system that might question their decisions or advocate for my interests. In an assisted living facility, surrounded by staff who answered to the people paying the bills rather than the residents receiving care, I would be effectively powerless to resist whatever financial arrangements David and Clara chose to make on my behalf. The house settled around me, with the familiar creaks and sighs of old wood adjusting to temperature changes, sounds that had once been as comforting as a lullaby, but now seemed ominous in their implications. Every noise reminded me that this home, built with my own hands and filled with decades of memories, might soon be occupied by people who had never appreciated its history or understood its significance. I could picture Clara redecorating the master bedroom, erasing the last traces of Eleanor's presence to make room for her own aesthetic preferences. The thought made my chest tight with an emotion that was part grief and part fury, a volatile combination that demanded action rather than passive acceptance. If they wanted to play games with my life and my legacy, it was time they learned that the old man they were trying to manipulate had resources and determination they hadn't counted on. The real question was no longer whether I would resist their plans, but how far I was willing to go to protect everything I'd built from the people who were supposed to cherish and preserve it. The brass nameplate on the office door read, Harris and Associates, in elegant script, the same lettering that had greeted me 40 years ago when I'd first sought legal advice about buying this building where Thomas Harris had practiced law for half a century. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned the familiar handle, not from age or medication, but from the weight of decisions I was about to make that would fundamentally alter the course of my family's future. The receptionist's desk sat empty in the outer office. Martha had retired 3 years ago, and Thomas had never bothered replacing her, preferring to manage his reduced caseload personally. The familiar smell of old leather and pipe tobacco hung in the air, comforting in its constancy, even as everything else in my life shifted beneath my feet like quicksand. Through the frosted glass door marked private, I could hear Thomas's voice on the phone, the same measured cadences that had guided me through Eleanor's estate planning and my own business dealings for decades. "George!" Thomas rose from behind his mahogany desk as I entered, his 73-year-old frame still imposing despite the silver hair and reading glasses that marked our shared journey into what younger people politely called our golden years. His handshake was firm, his pale blue eyes sharp with the intelligence that had made him one of the most respected attorneys in the county before semi-retirement, claimed most of his contemporaries. The office looked exactly as it had during my last visit 2 years ago. Law books lining every wall, family photographs clustered on the credenza, and the antique globe that concealed a bar Eleanor had always found amusing during our social visits. But today, the familiar surroundings felt different, charged with the significance of what I'd come to accomplish. Thomas gestured toward the leather chairs arranged near the window, and I settled into one with the careful movements of a man whose body was still healing from recent trauma. "You sounded troubled on the phone," Thomas said, closing the door behind us and returning to his seat with the deliberate movements of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for the things that mattered most. "What can I help you with?" His tone carried the professional concern that had made him such an effective advocate during his active years, but underneath it, I heard the warmth of genuine friendship that had survived business relationships and social obligations. We'd known each other since our children were young, had shared countless barbecues and holiday gatherings back when life seemed simpler, and family loyalty was something I'd never thought to question. Now, sitting across from the man who'd helped me structure my financial legacy to benefit the people I loved most, I felt the bitter irony of needing his expertise to protect that same legacy from those same people. "I need to make some changes to my estate planning," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected given the magnitude of what I was contemplating. "Significant changes." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from casual friendliness to focused attention as he recognized the gravity in my tone. His pen appeared in his hand with the automatic gesture of someone who'd spent decades taking careful notes during difficult conversations, and I noticed he'd already pulled a fresh legal pad from his desk drawer. The sight of that yellow paper, blank and waiting for the details of my family's betrayal, made something cold settle in my stomach. But there was no turning back now. Not after yesterday's conversation about assisted living. Not after learning about David's calls to the bank. Not after hearing Clara's casual certainty that my money was already theirs. "What kind of changes are we talking about?" Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral in the way that experienced lawyers used when they sensed their clients were about to reveal information that would require delicate handling. I took a breath, tasting the lingering pipe tobacco in the air, and began to explain everything that had happened since the barbecue. Thomas listened without interruption, his pen moving steadily across the legal pad as I described Ryan's push, the family's theatrical concern, Maria's revelations about kitchen conversations, David's inquiries at the bank, and finally yesterday's coordinated suggestion about assisted living. With each detail I shared, Thomas's expression grew more troubled, his professional mask slipping to reveal the genuine concern of an old friend watching another old friend navigate a devastating betrayal. "I see," he said when I finished, setting down his pen and removing his glasses to clean them with movements that suggested he was buying time to process what he'd heard. "And you're certain about these overheard conversations? About David's contact with the bank?" The questions weren't accusations, but the careful verification of someone who understood that family disputes based on misunderstandings could destroy relationships that might otherwise be salvaged. I appreciated his caution, but my certainty was absolute. Too many pieces fit together too perfectly for coincidence, and Maria's loyalty to my family had never been in question. Thomas replaced his glasses and met my eyes directly, his expression conveying both professional sympathy and personal outrage at the situation I'd described. "What are you thinking in terms of changes?" "I want to convert Ryan's education fund into a charitable trust," I said, the words coming more easily now that I'd begun to voice them aloud. The Eleanor Miller Memorial Trust for the Community Hospital. Thomas nodded, making notes as I continued. I want a new will with a no-contest clause, and I want to change my medical power of attorney. His pen paused at the last item, and he looked up with raised eyebrows that invited elaboration. I want to assign it to Maria, and to you, if you're willing, I continued. People I trust to make decisions based on my welfare rather than their inheritance prospects. The relief of finally taking concrete action was almost overwhelming. After days of feeling helpless and manipulated, I was reclaiming control over my own life and legacy. Thomas was quiet for several minutes, his legal mind undoubtedly working through the implications and potential complications of what I was proposing. The charitable trust is straightforward, he said finally. Tax advantageous, permanent, and completely legal. The hospital board will be thrilled. They've been struggling with funding for the new cardiac wing. He paused, and I caught a slight smile at the irony of my heart surgery funds ultimately benefiting other cardiac patients. The will revision is also routine, though I'll need to ask about your reasoning for the no-contest clause. It's a powerful deterrent, but it essentially disinherits anyone who challenges the document in court. The weight of that decision settled over me, final and irreversible, and I found myself thinking about David as a child, so eager to please and proud of my achievements. But that child had grown into a man who saw me as an inconvenient obstacle to wealth he felt entitled to claim. As for the power of attorney, Thomas continued, I'm honored by your trust, but I want to make sure you understand the implications. If you become incapacitated, Maria and I would be making all your medical and financial decisions. Your family would have no legal standing to override our choices. The phrase, your family, carried a weight of sadness that told me Thomas understood exactly what this conversation meant about the breakdown of relationships he'd watched develop over decades. These weren't just legal documents we were discussing. They were the concrete manifestation of my loss of faith in the people who should have been my strongest advocates and protectors. The realization that I needed legal barriers to protect myself from my own son and daughter-in-law was perhaps the most devastating aspect of this entire nightmare. There's one more thing, Thomas said, his voice taking on the careful tone he'd used when delivering difficult news to clients throughout his career. Are you planning to tell them about these changes? The question hung between us, loaded with implications about family dynamics and strategic considerations that went far beyond simple legal documentation. I thought about David's suggestion of assisted living, about Clara's casual certainty regarding my money, about Ryan's mocking laughter as I struggled in the lake. The temptation to confront them directly was strong, to watch their faces when they realized their plans had been discovered and countered. But that satisfaction would be temporary, and it might prompt them to escalate their efforts to have me declared incompetent or to challenge my mental capacity. Not yet, I said, surprised by the calculating coldness in my own voice. I want to see how far they're willing to go first. Thomas nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he understood the strategic wisdom of keeping my legal changes secret while gathering more evidence of my family's true intentions. How long will the paperwork take? I asked, suddenly eager to have these protections in place before David and Clara could implement whatever plans they were developing. The trust documents can be ready by tomorrow afternoon, Thomas replied. The will revision will take slightly longer, probably 2 days for proper drafting and review. The power of attorney forms are standard, so I can have those ready with the trust paperwork. As I prepared to leave, Thomas walked me to the door with the careful courtesy that had characterized our friendship for 4 decades. George, he said, his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that conveyed both professional confidence and personal support. I want you to know that what you're doing is not only legally sound, but morally justified. A man has the right to control his own assets and medical care, especially when the people who should be protecting him are instead planning to exploit him. His words carried the authority of someone who'd seen similar family situations throughout his career, and they provided a validation I hadn't realized I desperately needed. But I also want to give you one piece of advice from an old friend rather than your attorney. He paused, glancing back toward his office, as if making sure we wouldn't be overheard, then continued in a voice barely above a whisper. Don't announce it yet. Let them believe everything is proceeding according to their plans. Sometimes the most effective strategy is to allow your opponents to reveal the full scope of their intentions before you show your hand. The advice felt both wise and dangerous. Wise because it would give me a complete picture of what I was dealing with. Dangerous because it meant enduring more of their false concern and calculated manipulation while knowing exactly what they were really thinking. But Thomas was right. If I wanted to protect myself completely, I needed to understand completely what I was protecting myself from. The documents would be ready soon, creating an invisible shield around everything I'd worked to build. Until then, I would play the role of the trusting father and grandfather, letting them believe their performance was convincing while I gathered the evidence that would justify every legal barrier I was constructing between them and my life's work. The dining room felt different that evening, charged with undercurrents I was only beginning to understand. Dad, I've been thinking more about what we discussed yesterday, David said, as he set down the carving knife, his tone carefully casual in the way that meant he'd rehearsed this opening. Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and I noticed her eyes flick toward her husband with the kind of supportive attention that suggested they'd coordinated this conversation in advance. Even Ryan looked up from his phone, though his expression remained unreadable behind the screen of polite indifference teenagers wore like armor. The timing felt deliberate, waiting until we were all gathered around the dinner table where the facade of family unity would be hardest to maintain if the discussion grew uncomfortable. It was a strategic choice that reminded me David had spent years learning how to control conversations and manipulate outcomes in professional settings where much more than dinner was at stake. The assisted living facility, David continued when I didn't immediately respond. I know it's a big decision, but Clara and I have been researching options, and we really think it would be best for everyone involved. The phrase, everyone involved, struck me as particularly revealing. This wasn't about my welfare alone, but about arrangements that would benefit the entire family, presumably by removing me from the equation while providing them with the legal justification they'd need to assume control of my affairs. Clara nodded with the kind of earnest concern that would have been touching if I hadn't known about her phone conversations regarding my money being basically theirs. Her ability to maintain such a convincing performance while discussing my exile was impressive in its cold calculation, and I found myself wondering if she'd always been this manipulative, or if greed had transformed her into someone I'd never really known. I've actually looked into several places, Clara added, her voice bright with the enthusiasm of someone discussing vacation destinations rather than warehouses for inconvenient elderly relatives. Sunny Meadows has an opening next month, and Willowbrook could accommodate you before Christmas. Both have excellent reputations for cardiac care. The casual mention of cardiac care felt like a subtle threat disguised as consideration, a reminder that my recent surgery made me vulnerable in ways that could justify their intervention if I became too resistant to their suggestions. She'd clearly done her homework, researching facilities that specialized in exactly the kind of medical conditions that could be used to argue for my incompetence if I refused to cooperate voluntarily. The thoroughness of her preparation was both impressive and terrifying in its implications for how long they'd been planning this move. I took a slow sip of water, letting the silence stretch until I could feel their expectation building like pressure before a storm. Friday at 10, "I already have an appointment," I said finally, my voice level and matter-of-fact, as if I were discussing a routine dental cleaning rather than whatever they imagined I was referring to. The words were deliberately ambiguous. They could interpret them as acceptance of their assisted living suggestions, or as something else entirely. I watched their faces carefully, noting the quick exchange of glances between David and Clara that suggested they were trying to determine whether I was capitulating to their plans or pursuing some agenda they hadn't anticipated. The uncertainty in their expressions was gratifying in a way that surprised me with its intensity. David's relief was visible as he leaned forward with the kind of pleased attention he'd once shown when I'd agreed to co-sign his first mortgage. "That's wonderful, Dad. Which facility did you choose?" His eagerness to nail down the specifics revealed just how invested he was in having this matter resolved quickly and permanently. I could almost see him mentally calculating timelines, how soon I'd be safely institutionalized, how quickly he could assume power of attorney, how rapidly my assets could be transferred to accounts he controlled. The naked anticipation in his voice made my chest tight with an emotion that was part grief for the relationship we'd once had, and part anger at the man he'd apparently become. This wasn't the son who'd once built model airplanes with me in the basement, but someone who saw me primarily as an obstacle to be managed rather than a father to be honored. "I prefer to keep my medical appointments private," I said, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that felt like drawing a line in sand. "I'm sure you understand." The slight shift in David's expression told me he definitely didn't understand, and that my deflection had introduced an element of uncertainty into what he'd assumed would be a straightforward capitulation to their pressure. Clara's smile flickered almost imperceptibly, the first crack in her performance since this conversation began. They'd expected compliance, not evasion, and my refusal to provide details was clearly not part of the script they'd prepared for this scene. The power dynamics around the table were shifting in ways none of us had fully anticipated, and I found myself curious to see how they'd adjust their strategy to account for my unexpected resistance. Ryan, who had been unusually quiet throughout the adult conversation, suddenly looked up from his phone with the half-smile I'd learned to associate with his more unpleasant impulses. "Don't be so dramatic, Grandpa," he said, his voice carrying the same casual mockery he'd used as I struggled in the lake water. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, not because of its inherent cruelty, but because of the memories it triggered and the context in which he'd chosen to deploy it again. This wasn't coincidence. He was deliberately echoing his words from that afternoon when he'd found my terror entertaining, reminding me of my helplessness while reinforcing the family narrative that I was prone to unnecessary anxiety about situations they had completely under control. The calculated malice of using those specific words in this specific moment revealed a level of psychological sophistication that was chilling in someone so young. I set down my fork and looked directly at Ryan, letting the silence expand until it filled the dining room like smoke. His smirk faltered under my steady gaze, and I noticed his fingers tighten around his phone, as if the device could somehow protect him from whatever he was reading in my expression. The confident young man who'd pushed me into the lake and laughed at my struggle was suddenly uncertain, perhaps recognizing that the grandfather he'd been tormenting was no longer playing by the same rules that had governed our relationship for 16 years. David and Clara had gone completely still, their dinner conversation abandoned as they sensed the shift in atmosphere without fully understanding what had caused it. The tension around the table was almost visible, crackling with unspoken threats and barely contained emotions that none of us were quite ready to articulate. "You're absolutely right, Ryan," I said finally, my voice so quiet they had to strain to hear it. "Drama is such an exhausting waste of energy." I picked up my fork and took another bite of Maria's roast, chewing methodically while maintaining eye contact with my grandson until he looked away first. The victory was small, but significant. For the first time since this nightmare began, I'd made one of them uncomfortable instead of the other way around. David cleared his throat nervously, and Clara reached for the wine bottle with movements that betrayed her unease, despite her continued attempts to maintain her nurturing facade. Even the sound of silverware against china seemed unnaturally loud in the continued silence that followed my response. The rest of dinner passed in a fog of forced normalcy that fooled no one present. David made several attempts to revive the conversation about assisted living, but my non-committal responses and Ryan's obvious discomfort had shifted the evening's momentum away from their carefully planned intervention. Clara's performance remained polished, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes as she tried to determine whether I was simply being difficult or whether I knew more than I was revealing about their true motivations. When Maria appeared to clear the dishes, I noticed her glance toward me with an expression that suggested she'd sensed the undercurrents even from the kitchen, and I wondered what conversations she might have overheard while preparing our meal. As my family prepared to leave that evening, David made one final attempt to pin down the details of my Friday appointment. "Dad, if you need someone to drive you or help with paperwork, you know we're here for you," he said, his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that felt more possessive than supportive. "Just let us know what kind of assistance you need." The offer was clearly designed to give him access to whatever facility or medical professional I'd be seeing, allowing him to gather information about my mental state and treatment plans that could be useful if they decided to pursue guardianship proceedings. I patted his hand with what I hoped appeared to be paternal affection, while silently marveling at how thoroughly his concern masked his actual agenda. "Thank you, son," I said, the endearment tasting bitter in my mouth despite decades of habit. "I think I can manage on my own." As I watched them drive away, their taillights disappearing around the corner where Eleanor and I used to take evening walks, I realized that Friday's meeting with Thomas would be more than just a legal formality. It would be the moment when I stopped being a victim of their manipulation and became something far more dangerous to their plans. A fully informed opponent who understood exactly what he was fighting for and against. The morning started like any other, with Maria bringing me coffee on the front porch, where I'd taken to spending my early hours watching the lake that had almost claimed my life 2 weeks ago. The water looked deceptively peaceful in the dawn light, its surface broken only by the occasional duck or the gentle ripples created by fish feeding near the shore. My chest felt stronger each day, the surgical scar pulling less with each breath, and I found myself thinking that recovery from betrayal might follow a similar timeline. Painful at first, but gradually healing into something harder and more resilient than what had existed before. The leather notebook lay open beside my coffee cup, its pages now filled with careful observations and decisive actions that would have been unthinkable just a month ago. The man who'd trusted blindly in family loyalty was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love without wisdom was simply another form of vulnerability waiting to be exploited. I heard the mail truck before I saw it, the familiar rumble of Mr. Peterson's route making its way down Maple Street with the punctuality of a Swiss timepiece. From my position on the porch, I could see him stop at David and Clara's house 3 blocks away, and I knew that among the usual bills and advertisements would be 2 manila envelopes bearing the return address of Harris and Associates. Thomas had warned me the letters would arrive today, and despite my careful preparation for this moment, I felt my heart rate increase with anticipation that was part excitement and part dread. There was no going back after today, no possibility of pretending the documents didn't exist, or that the legal barriers I'd constructed could be undone by family conversations and emotional appeals. The bridge between my old life and whatever came next was about to be burned completely and permanently. The phone started ringing 43 minutes later. I'd been counting because Thomas had predicted they'd call within an hour of receiving the letters, and his legal experience once again proved accurate. Maria answered in the kitchen, her voice carrying the careful politeness she used with people she didn't entirely trust, and I heard her say, "Yes, Mr. David, he's here. Let me get him for you." But instead of calling me to the phone immediately, she appeared on the porch with an expression that mixed concern with something that looked almost like admiration. "They sound very upset," she said quietly, holding the cordless phone like it might explode. "Mrs. Clara is in the background, and she's not using her inside voice." I could hear the shouting even through the closed phone lines, voices raised in panic and fury that confirmed everything Thomas and I had anticipated about their reaction to discovering their plans had been discovered and countered. "George Miller speaking," I said into the phone, my voice level despite the chaos I could hear erupting on the other end of the line. David's voice came through almost incoherent with rage and disbelief, his usual professional composure completely shattered by whatever he'd read in Thomas's carefully worded legal documents. "Dad, what the hell is this? What have you done?" The profanity was unusual for David, who prided himself on maintaining control in difficult situations, and his loss of composure told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly my legal changes had disrupted whatever timeline they'd established for accessing my assets. Behind his voice, I could hear Clara's higher-pitched protests, words like "impossible" and "can't do this," punctuating her husband's more direct accusations. The sound of their distress should have made me feel guilty or sad, but instead I felt only the cold satisfaction of a chess player who'd successfully executed a strategy his opponents never saw coming. "I made some adjustments to my estate planning," I said calmly, taking a sip of coffee that tasted better than it had in weeks. "Nothing that should concern you unless you had specific expectations about my money." The silence that followed my words was profound, filled with implications they were probably still trying to fully comprehend. Thomas had been thorough in his documentation. The letters would have detailed not just the changes to my will and trust documents, but also the reasons behind those changes, including references to overheard conversations and suspicious banking inquiries that made it clear I knew exactly what they'd been planning. David's breathing was audible through the phone, the kind of rapid, shallow sounds that suggested he was struggling to process information that fundamentally altered his understanding of reality. "You can't do this," Clara's voice came through clearly now, apparently having wrestled the phone away from her husband. "That money was for Ryan's education. We've been counting on it." The admission was startling in its directness. No pretense about my welfare or their concern for my safety, just naked acknowledgement that they'd been counting on money that had never actually belonged to them. Her voice carried the outrage of someone who'd discovered their inheritance had been stolen rather than simply redirected. And I realized she genuinely believed she had some legitimate claim to funds I'd earned and saved throughout decades of work they'd never truly understood or appreciated. The entitlement in her tone was breathtaking, and I found myself wondering if she'd always felt this way about my assets, or if the prospect of sudden wealth had corrupted whatever genuine affection she'd once felt for me. "Ryan's education will be provided for," I said, my voice remaining steady despite the storm of emotion I could hear building on the other end of the line. "The Eleanor Miller Memorial Trust will offer scholarships to deserving students, including Ryan, if he qualifies through the normal application process." The irony wasn't lost on me that my grandson would now have to compete with other young people for access to money that had originally been set aside specifically for him. But he'd forfeited any special consideration when he'd chosen to mock my near drowning rather than show concern for my welfare. The trust would ensure the money served its intended educational purpose while removing any possibility that it could be diverted to other uses by family members who saw it as a general inheritance rather than a specific educational fund. David's voice returned, now carrying the measured tones he used when trying to control legal situations that had moved beyond his immediate influence. "Dad, let's talk about this rationally. You're clearly upset about something, and maybe we can work through whatever misunderstanding has occurred." The attempt at manipulation was so transparent that I almost laughed. He was treating me like a confused client who needed to be managed, rather than a father who'd discovered his son's true priorities. His legal training was showing through his personal distress, the automatic shift to negotiation mode when confronted with an unfavorable situation. But what he didn't seem to understand was that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved through discussion, but a fundamental revelation about family dynamics that couldn't be undone through clever arguments or emotional appeals. "There's no misunderstanding," I said, watching a great blue heron land gracefully on the dock I'd built with my own hands decades ago. "I understand perfectly. You called the bank about transfer procedures. You researched assisted living facilities. You discussed my money as if it were already yours. I simply acted on that understanding." Each accusation landed like a physical blow, judging by the silence that followed. And I could almost picture them looking at each other with the dawning realization that their private conversations hadn't been as private as they'd assumed. Maria had been their undoing, her loyalty to me overriding any reluctance to share information that painted them in an unflattering light. They'd underestimated the housekeeper, just as they'd underestimated the grandfather they'd assumed was too trusting and too physically compromised to fight back effectively. The argument that followed was spectacular in its intensity and revealing in its content. Clara's voice rose to near shrieking levels as she demanded to know who had been spying on their private conversations, while David alternated between legal threats and emotional manipulation, promising everything from renewed family closeness to complete transparency about their financial motivations. Through it all, I remained silent, letting them rage against consequences they'd brought entirely upon themselves through choices that revealed character flaws I'd been too naive to recognize earlier. Their fury was proof that I'd made the right decisions. People who truly cared about my welfare rather than my bank account wouldn't have reacted to my legal protections with such desperate anger. The conversation ended when Clara apparently threw something against a wall hard enough that the crash came through clearly over the phone line, followed by David's muffled apologies and the abrupt silence of a disconnected call. Maria found me on the porch an hour later, her expression mixing satisfaction with concern, as she settled into the wicker chair Eleanor had used for morning coffee during her final years. "I walked past their house on my way to the grocery store," she said quietly, glancing toward the lake as if the peaceful water could somehow cleanse the ugliness of what we'd both witnessed. The shouting could be heard from the sidewalk. Mrs. Peterson from next door was watering her flowers, but obviously listening to every word. She paused, choosing her words carefully in the way that suggested she was about to share information that would be significant, but possibly difficult to hear. "They looked like the ground was pulled out under their feet," she continued. "Mr. David was pacing in the living room, and Mrs. Clara was crying, but not the sad kind of crying, the angry kind." I nodded, unsurprised by her description, but grateful for the confirmation that my legal changes had achieved their intended effect of completely disrupting whatever plans they'd made for my money and my future. "They'll try other approaches," I said, thinking of David's legal training and Clara's talent for manipulation. Emotional appeals, medical concerns, maybe even attempts to have my competency evaluated. Maria's expression grew troubled at the mention of competency challenges, and I realized she was probably worried about her own position if my family succeeded in having me declared unable to manage my own affairs. But Thomas had anticipated those possibilities, and built protections into the legal documents that would make such challenges extremely difficult to pursue successfully. The no contest clause in my will meant that any attempt to overturn my decisions would result in complete disinheritance, and the medical power of attorney assignments to Maria and Thomas provided an additional layer of protection against involuntary institutionalization. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself returning repeatedly to the porch, drawn by the view of the lake that had once nearly killed me, and now served as a daily reminder of how thoroughly my life had changed in just 2 weeks. The water looked different in the fading light, less threatening, and more like the peaceful refuge it had been during happier times when family gatherings meant genuine joy rather than calculated performance. I opened my notebook to a fresh page and wrote what I knew would be the final entry in this particular chapter of my life. They thought I'd drown. Instead, I built a dock strong enough to watch them sink. The metaphor felt perfect. They'd pushed me into dangerous water expecting me to go under quietly. But I'd used my own strength and the solid foundation of legal planning to pull myself to safety while they floundered in the consequences of their own greed and deception. The sun was setting over the lake when Maria brought me dinner on a tray, her movements careful and considerate in the way that reminded me why I'd chosen her as one of my medical advocates. "Will they come by tonight?" she asked, settling the tray on the small table beside my chair with the quiet efficiency that characterized all her actions. I considered the question seriously, thinking about David's legal mind and Clara's emotional volatility, trying to predict how they'd process the day's revelations and what strategies they might employ next. But as I watched the last light fade from the water and felt the peace that came with knowing I'd protected everything I'd worked to build, I realized it didn't matter what they decided to do next. The documents were filed, the trust was established, and the power of attorney was transferred. Whatever moves they made now would be defensive rather than offensive, reactions to my initiatives rather than implementations of their own plans. For the first time in weeks, I was no longer playing catch-up in a game whose rules I hadn't understood, and the feeling was better than any medication the doctors had prescribed for my healing heart.